let's kick it off today, Ben. We are going to do the same thing. We're going to give you a basis around the economy first. Then we'll pivot into how we feel that'll flow into the property market. And then we will bring it home, Ben, with a quick look around the grounds at headline level, and also give some detail for some folks for some takeaways. So stick around for that. But where do you want to kick it off, Ben?
Well, I think the main story is obviously interest rates. Interest rates have both a sentiment as well as a practical outcome in terms of the cost of money and how much demand it's going to drive. So if we think about that, we've got to ultimately think about inflation. So I want to start with telling the story of inflation. That is the key lever that's going to make changes in terms of what's going to be happening. So what we want to see in the data is what's happening with business investment. So I'm going to sort of tell a story here that sort of unpacks the levers associated with that. So when a business has basically several levers in which they can pull, given the economic environment they're operating in. So if demand starts falling away, in other words, people aren't buying their products, they can choose to do a couple of things. They can reduce their prices, which is awesome because that's disinflationary, which is where we ultimately want to get to. But they can also look internally and say, well, what are the cost of our inputs in making and supplying our goods? Can we find cheaper ways or ways to increase that? What about productivity? Ultimately, can we make our people more productive in the goods and services that we make? And then ultimately, if none of those things can happen, then it really does require layoffs. So we would then remove a number of people in our employment story, and so they would become unemployed. We would restructure our business to try and get our cost base right, and so ultimately we can keep our profit margins there. But if we decide that we're going to reduce our profit margins in the short term, then we don't lay off those people. So that's the sort of decisions that need to happen, and that sort of leads into the story of demand and growth. So an economy, the idea of an economy is basically if you can keep growing it, you improve the standard of living and the quality of life for the people inside that economy. And so the things that we're going to be looking at really closely when it comes to economic activity and behaviour is consumer spending. And we had some pretty shocking numbers in the January data that was showing that consumer spending, even on a per capita basis, was definitely going down. But even with our growing population, the underlying consumer spending and retail spending was really, really poor numbers. So that's telling us that the discretionary money that households had 2 years ago, when interest rates were really low, has now been dried up. And so ultimately people are very, very careful in terms of what they're spending their money on. Then if we look at business spending, and I'll get you to do government spending, Bryce, but business spending slowing, it's definitely slowing down. Like their sentiment and their confidence is definitely slowing as they're seeing that economic water wheel slowing down. So they are still spending in some areas of the economy, but in other areas, that's certainly on the consumer side, that is definitely drying up at the moment as they, again, start thinking about how they protect their profitability and those types of things before they have to lay off any workers. And on the government spending side, Bryce?
Well, it's still pretty strong, isn't it, Ben? And largely around a lot of infrastructure projects that the government have going on. But where that shows up as a challenge in the economy is largely around the demand for labour. When you have someone who's employing whose focus isn't around efficiency, it's around getting the job done irrespective of the budget. That provides a challenge when you've got government spending and private sector spending and private sector people chasing the demand for the labour, and then the demand over here is high. That is where there's an ongoing challenge, because you want to speak to unemployment shortly, but that all plays into that. So if you've got consumer spending slowing tick, you've got business spending slowing but marginally tick, but then you've got government spending. Well, there's a question mark at best, but clearly there's a cross in that column.
Yeah, and so all of that then leads to, okay, tight labour market. That means wages growth is good. That's actually really good for medium to longer term price growth in property, because it means borrowing power goes up. And we've seen some really strong wages growth over the last 12 to 18 months. We're comfortable where that sits at the moment, so we're not seeing any pressures from wages growth. But it is ultimately, I think, the biggest indicator and data feed that the RBA is going to be focusing on is the employment or unemployment number. So when the unemployment gets a 4 handle in front of it, so when we move from, we were down at 3.7, then we're going at 3.9. Once we start seeing unemployment at around a 4 or a 4.1, 4.2, that is really going to start to play on the RBA's mind. So because they know that, obviously cash rate is a blunt instrument, and they know that there's a lag effect both ways. So they know we're in contractory territory in terms of slowing down that water wheel. And so it's going to, if we slow down too much, we could do more harm than good. And so ultimately that's what they're going to be looking at. So that is going to be the first thing that they're going to be watching. So full-time employment, part-time employment, in terms of hours worked, and underutilization of that labour market is going to be really important for that story. So we would say, obviously, there are others, government spending, sentiment, and all of those types of things, and consumer spending. But now it all goes back to the employment story. If employment stays strong, that means the economy generally stays strong. That means people are still able to gainfully get income and then spend that money as well. And so that means that interest rates could stay higher for longer because the businesses don't have to drop their prices. They don't have to reduce the inflationary pressure in the cycle. So that's ultimately where we sit. So in terms of the interest rate story, if unemployment starts to go higher, the Reserve Governor and the board will have to move. And we saw Michelle Bullock at the recent Senate Standing Committee, where she spoke last Friday, was around this story of we are willing to move the cash rate lower before inflation gets within our bandwidth of that 2 to 3%. So if we see inflation hitting 3%, that could be the trigger for them to start to move on the cash rate. And ultimately, from our point of view, if that happens in the middle of the year, then we're going to obviously see a shift in sentiment, where we're moving from a restrictive to an easing cycle of liquidity. And that has a positive impact on the property market, doesn't it, Bryce?
It does.